So all eyes on India and its G20 presidency, the big summit, which is happening this weekend. Huge expectations, not just domestically, but internationally as well. The big question is, will there be a joint communique? If not, what are the other substantial takeaways that we can look forward to? The absence of Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, how much of a dampener will that be? And the larger, wider trajectory about multilateralism, its relevance in the modern day and age, at a time when everyone is talking about a new Cold War, a great power competition, what have you. To discuss all this and more, I'm joined by a very special guest here in our studios. He's made the trek all the way up from Delhi to Noida. Dhruva Jaishankar is the Executive Director at ORF America. Thank you very much, Dhruv, for joining us here. First things first, I mean, how was the drive up from Delhi to Noida? I'm sure the city is decked up with G20 decor.
The roads are clear.
Okay.
It looks like the Delhi looks like it has a bit of a shine to it. I think as world leaders start descending upon the city today. But skies are blue. So
the cops didn't stop you and check for ID and stuff, right?
So I think but it looks like the city is in welcome mode for a lot of guests.
But this is like the culmination of what's been a year-long presidency. I think the Prime Minister blogged about it yesterday, saying 200 meetings, 60 cities from Srinagar to Thiruvananthapuram. Have you seen anything like this? Any other G20 president sort of democratizing and almost making it like a people's presidency? And why is that important?
Well, the G20 is a relatively new organization. It's only, at least at this level, has really been a outcome of the global financial crisis in 2008, and it got and it has been a rotating presidency. For many countries, I think particularly the G7 countries, they have grown accustomed to hosting large summits, and it's in some ways rather unusual, just given where India has been and its membership of various international organizations, that this occasion hasn't arisen before. So I do think it seems interesting that to take a full advantage of this, making it about sort of the issues, making it about India's role on the global stage. I was thinking back on sort of what a similar, obviously India played a leading role in the Bandung conference in the 1950s, although that was hosted in Indonesia, the Non-Alignment Movement Summit in 1983. In fact, India also hosted a COP, a climate summit in 2002. But this is really on the scale and magnitude, we haven't quite seen something like this.
But even in his bilateral meetings, the Prime Minister has always sort of been a big believer in taking meetings out of Delhi, moving diplomacy out of Delhi. We've seen meetings in Ahmedabad, we've seen it in Banaras and so on. It's a bit of a complaint even with the West, right? In America, all the meetings are sort of consolidated around your town in DC. This idea of democratizing diplomacy, is it gimmickry, is it optics, or is it actually really, does it actually percolate down to smaller towns and cities?
I think part of the issue I've noticed, just in my profession, we even 15 years ago, a lot of us just talked to each other. We talked in a small bubble. We talked in arcane terms. We talked about rules-based international order. And one of the things, I felt this strongly, is when you talk to people, even family members or friends who are outside of this professional circuit, how do you actually explain why is diplomacy important? Why is war, what matters of war and peace, the trading order, global governance? What does it actually mean? And I'm not saying all of that has been accomplished this year, but I do think a certain decisive step has been taken. And I certainly felt this, traveling around India, to most states, there's a great hunger, particularly amongst younger people, to know what is it about when a Indian leader goes abroad. Why are they having these meetings? Why are they meeting with CEOs? What is happening in this trade negotiation? How does it affect them? And I think we're starting to see some of that filtering down, the idea that Ukraine has the war in Ukraine has a direct impact on people's pockets here, their savings, their margins. That's just one example, but food security, another example. So again, there has traditionally been a gap, and it's not just in India, gap between talking about international relations in these very esoteric terms and the reality and how it affects people's day-to-day lives, even though there has been that connection. And I think this is an attempt at narrowing that gap.
Okay. Let's talk about the war, since you mentioned this, and this is a thing that's divided the world. You have the United States, its Western partners, its European partners on the one side. Increasingly, you're seeing Russia and China on another corner. And then you have the rest of the world, India included, somewhere in the middle. As G20 president, obviously all the focus is going to be on whether a joint communique comes out, how much negotiations are going on around it. Do you believe a joint statement is possible? And if they're not able to thrash out one, what does that mean for how Delhi's G20 summit will be judged?
I'm not sure that's the only benchmark on which it should be judged. But that being said, I think you framed it correctly. And what we've seen in the ministerial meetings earlier this year has been what the United States and its allies, NATO allies, Japan, Korea, Australia, pushing for a much tougher language, condemning Russia and Ukraine. Russia and China obviously pushing back. And I think there was a belief that a formulation had been worked out last year in Bali that was acceptable to all parties. What we've seen,
what's changed between Bali and now?
What seems to have started with the finance ministers meeting in Bangalore earlier this year, and it has continued, it seems to be a sort of tougher line taken by Russia and China. The formulation that was then worked out was that there would be essentially a dissenting note in the statement that was issued. Now, again, the negotiations are underway right now. It would be premature to say what the outcome will be. But I think that is all being hashed out now, whether a formulation can be reached, a consensus can be reached. So I think that, for me, I think that the takeaway is that for a lot of those countries in the middle, if you will, countries that would like to have good relations with the West and also have good relations with Russia and or China, that they largely supported that old formulation. And it wasn't, it was only two dissenting parties. So that, I think, is more significant than the fact that there was a much greater split or divide. And I think we'll see what the outcome is going to be.
So when you say the difference between Bali and now is that Russia and China become far more entrenched in their positions and far more entrenched in their opposition to the West and its partners. I'm just curious to know the absence of Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin at the G20 summit in Delhi. How much of a dampener is that?
Well, dampener for whom, right?
For India?
No, I mean, India's invited the parties. Both China and Russia will be represented here, although not at the senior most levels. Invitations did go out. So I don't think it actually impinges very much on, it says less about India, it says more about Russia and China. In Russia's case, I think that it was more expected, I think, for some time, just given the complexities, but not respect to India, but its differences with the West. And this would be, had President Putin decided to come, it would be the first time he'd be in the same room as many of these other world leaders with whom he's been at loggerheads. Xi was, I think, a slightly different case, and we don't know exactly the thinking behind it, but it is significant that he's not here.
But in this sort of, many people are calling this the new Cold War, emerging great power competition, and so on and so forth. Where do countries like India find space? I mean, India is trying to sort of carve out a space as the voice of the global South. You think that is where India will find itself in?
I mean, I get variations on that question a lot in the US and in Europe and other places. And, I think it's quite clear that when you explain to people how the world, people have a tough time putting themselves in other people's shoes. And when you explain where India is coming from, I think people largely understand it. They understand that, how India sees the world. And obviously a lot more needs to be done to explain that to people. But, I find largely now, at least in governments in the US and the West, they understand where India, they may not agree with it, but they understand where India is coming from, that India has a defense relationship with Russia, that it has, the global oil and energy markets, global food markets. There is an obligation to the people of India, and also India is not alone in this, that in the global South these are legitimate concerns. And I think, in fact, what we see and hear this week from many of those Western countries is exactly that acknowledgement of those concerns, that yes, there is a war going on, but they are ultimately, leaders of these countries are responsible to, first and foremost, to their own people. Now, again, with that being said, I think we are also seeing in some ways India deepening its ties with perhaps with the exception of China, with many of these other countries. There have been attempts at widening India-Russia trade, with mixed success. India and Europe are engaged, the EU are engaged in a trade and technology council. The only other country by which the EU has that arrangement with is the US. India and the US, of course, we saw during the Prime Minister's visit to Washington, have been deepening its relations. India and the Quad, India and Saudi Arabia. So I think everyone sees, China as a slight exception because of the differences. But with most of the other invited participating countries, you have seen very conscious attempts at India making genuine attempts at deepening cooperation.
So, the G20, as you said, really became this pinnacle of multilateralism after the global financial crisis. You needed the biggest economies, the best minds to come together in a room and solve the world's problems. I had Professor Mearsheimer yesterday on the show, and he said multilateralism, as we know it over the last 10, 15 years, if not dead, it's certainly on life support. Do you agree with that assessment? And if it is, what is the new multilateralism? I mean, in this arc of the US and its partners on the one side, Russia, China on the other, what is the new multilateralism?
So, I don't fully disagree with that view that Professor Mearsheimer has, largely because what we think of as the governing structures of the international order really came about at the beginning or during the Cold War.
Correct.
At a time when the power disparities were very different, World War II, it was really in the immediate aftermath of World War II. What happened, with the end of the Cold War, the nature of it was not a big catastrophic, and this is a good thing, there was not a big catastrophic war. There wasn't a chance to hit refresh on the international order. And that's where we saw this gap emerge, which is in a post-Cold War world, you still had these archaic institutions in place that no longer reflected, even forget about India for a second, but even Germany and Japan, which were large economies, were not adequately represented at bodies like the UN Security Council. So I think that is where some of this disparity has come about. And now in this emerging world, which is in fact quite competitive and increasingly competitive, as you mentioned, we're now seeing a number of attempted formulations in an attempt at shaping that international order. And the outcome is yet to be determined. The G20 still makes sense because, again, you need one venue for all the world's major economies to convene. But we're starting to see this with BRICS and Chinese attempts at particularly the institutions in which it has invested, trying to expand them as much as possible. The US is trying to put new life into some of the old institutions while creating new ones. But we're already seeing, India part of new configurations as well. Whether it's the Quad on one hand, I2U2 and to the West, on issue-specific, artificial intelligence. There are now new bodies being created. We may see some announcements in the next few days on new international institutions. So that I think, there is a very pessimistic view, and it is a much more competitive world, but there's still issues on which there is, a degree of cooperation, whether in climate change, food security, stabilizing financial markets, and a lot of that is taking place beneath that level of competition.
So do you see multilateralism itself moving in a direction where, like you said, the groupings that China is invested in and it's promoting, BRICS and SCO and so on, it'll have active role and participation there, but some of the other groupings it may not be interested in as much. So you're going to see two sets of multilateralism.
That's I think there's a realization to some degree, and there are concerns about that. That being said, I think there'll always be room for certain types of institutions, whether it's at the United Nations, whether it's the G20, whose sole purpose is to be inclusive. And where even if there are differences, those differences are discussed and debated. So I think there'll be room for both kinds of institutions, but perhaps some of the more effective and efficient ones will be ones where there's more like-mindedness on one side or the other.
So let me sort of get to the concluding part of this interview where, all right, so Delhi is playing host to the biggest countries this weekend. What is the one thing that you will be looking for as a benchmark or a yardstick that needs to be crossed for it to be declared as, okay, this is a successful G20?
Well, I think, for many years, there has been a lot of lip service paid to the developing world, to the global south, by the world's leading powers. I think the real test will there be some very concrete outcomes, commitments to change and reform institutions, commitments for financing, commits for sustainability and standards, that will actually benefit the global south. And I think if there is something, a set of outcomes where India can show that we didn't just talk the talk, but we walk the talk, that will be the single. We look back and say that is what will have made the Delhi summit a success.
All right, it's about walking the talk and not talking the talk.
On the global south.
On the global south. All right. So I guess we're sort of moving in that direction. I think the Prime Minister has also mentioned that a couple of times in the last week about the global south having a presence on the high table, inclusion of the African Union, for example. That's a proposal that's come from India. So finally, as we conclude, you're as much a Delhi boy as you are a global citizen. What would your recommendation be to the visiting heads of state and government as to what are the places to go to for the best food and the best local culture in Delhi?
I would love to give my recommendations. Unfortunately, I don't think they will have much time. It's 2 days. They'll have very scripted schedules, very tight meetings. And I think while there will be time for cultural, for shopping and culture and food on the sidelines, it will all be very carefully curated. So I don't think this will be the occasion on which to do that. But some of the leaders coming have actually done some very interesting things in the past. I know some are visiting Humayun's tomb, for example. One of the things, actually, much before he became Prime Minister, I had a conversation with Anthony Albanese, who's now the Prime Minister of Australia. He was then an MP, and he had backpacked in India actually when he was younger, so knew India quite well. And one day on his time off, he was visiting India as part of a parliamentary delegation. He told me he took the metro and went to Akshardham.
Oh, nice.
And that was what he did in his time off. So I don't think he'll have the occasion to do it this time.
But not without security.
People should ask. People should ask him.
All right. Thank you very much, Dhruva Jaishankar. It's always a pleasure speaking with you. We'll see how the Delhi G20 is judged, what its outcomes are, and most importantly, whether India can become a bridge in what is an increasingly fractured world and perhaps a voice of the global south.